Well, this might end up being more than 2 parts, but we'll see. Here's the next chunk of chapter 2. Briefly, crudely, and from the author's necessarily subjective synthesis, the Gnostic model of the cosmos is something like the following. 1. Differentiated existence, the multiverse, was created when a divine unity emanated from itself paired opposites called syzygies, which are mated male and female powers. 2. From the symbolic intercourse of these paired opposites was born a vast multiverse of worlds and dimensions, both what we call physical worlds, as well as worlds of matter so subtle that we would label them thought, emotion, or intuition. This multiverse is called by the Gnostics the pleroma, which means fullness in Greek. It is indeed a fullness, for it constitutes everything that exists in all possible dimensions of differentiated reality. 3. Powerful hierarchies of intelligent entities evolved to take their niches in these subtle realms, much in the way we inhabit our physical dimension. Because of the limitless differentiation within the pleroma, these intelligences of necessity express all possible nuances of being and meaning, from gods and angels to daemons and devils, from the personalities of starfish to the patterns within the genetic code. 4. Our space-time world was created by more or less inferior inner powers, not by the Supreme Godhead, which is a seamless unity, but by lesser intelligences, who use our world for the purpose of experiencing a physical dimension through the human body and psyche. 5. Human beings are essentially the slaves and puppets of these entities. The Gnostics called them archons, which is the Greek word for authority or ruler. Because the human psyche is a microcosm of the multiverse, each of us is a composite being, not a unity, but a multiplicity. It is only our illusion of unity which enables the archons to rule our lives, and we experience their rule in the form of thoughts, emotions, drives, and instincts. 6. The Gnostics assert that Yahweh, the God of Judaism and Christianity, and by extension any differentiated deity, is not the Supreme Godhead. Any deity with a distinct personality cannot be identical with the Godhead, because the latter is a unity which transcends all characterization. 7. God, with a capital G, for the Gnostic, is not a being, but a state of being. One either experiences this ineffable state of consciousness, or experiences a state of separation from it. It follows that to defer to the lesser archonic powers is to ensure one's continued bondage to a differentiated existence in the pleroma. 8. The Gnostic, realizing the situation, seeks to transcend the pleroma, the multiverse, and attain a state of oneness in the Godhead, the universe as it is in itself. Since Gnosticism postulates reincarnation as one of its main tenets, to be united with the Godhead meant that any individual soul who could accomplish this was freed from rebirth in the multiverse. We will now briefly look at Jung's conception of the psyche and see why it is considered a Gnostic system. For the purposes of this chapter, I will try to confine myself to the Jungian version of Gnostic terminology as much as possible, because it reflects the scientific expectations of our era. Jung differentiated 3 main foci within the greater psyche: the ego, the archetypal complexes, and the self. It is absolutely essential that the reader understands these distinctions, as the proper comprehension of this interpretation of the psyche is utterly dependent upon them. The ego complex. The ego is the complex of conscious awareness of a physical space-time dimension. You are almost certainly focused in your ego mode of perception as you read or hear these words. We will discuss the role of the ego in more detail later. The archetypal complexes. The archetypal complexes are not as easily comprehended. Jung identified them with the instincts, but also implied that they were something more. If one carefully monitors the feelings, emotions, appetites, and drives which spontaneously emerge into awareness from the psyche, but refuses to act on them or identify with them, one soon begins to realize that these forces behave exactly like autonomous entities. That is, they behave like others. This is a subtle as well as a disturbing distinction to make, because we're used to seeing ourselves as unified rather than composite beings. Another quote from Jung. The so-called unity of consciousness is an illusion. It is really a wish dream. It is really a wish dream. We'd like to think that we are one, but we are not, most decidedly not. We are not really masters in our house. We like to believe in our willpower and in our energy and in what we can do. But when it comes to a real showdown, we find that we can only do it to a certain extent because we are hampered by those little devils, the complexes. Complexes are autonomous groups of associations that have a tendency to move by themselves and to live their life apart from our intentions. I hold that the personal unconscious, as well as the collective unconscious, consists of an indefinite, because unknown, number of complexes or fragmentary personalities. Jung, Analytical Psychology, its theory and practice. This is to most people a truly fantastic idea, which is usually rejected out of hand if it is considered at all. Yet, recent research supports the concept. The phenomenon of multiple personality disorder has received considerable study in the past few decades, and contemporary versions of Jung's observations are being hypothesized to explain its bizarre symptoms. John O'Bears, a psychologist studying multiple personality disorder, postulates the theory of co-consciousness thus. Co-consciousness is the existence within a single human organism of more than one consciously experiencing psychological entity, each with some sense of its own identity or selfhood relatively separate and discrete from other similar entities, and with separate conscious experiences, occurring simultaneously with one another within this human organism. The theory of co-consciousness assumes that each part of any human individual has some sense of selfhood of its own, discrete from that of the other parts and the self proper. Co-consciousness assumes that each part of this unconscious must have its own ongoing conscious experience. There can be no such thing as an unconscious in any absolute sense. Unconsciousness can only be relative to one particular part. J. O. Bears, Unity and Multiplicity. Using the modern terminology of psychology, both Jung and Bears are describing the ancient Gnostic concept of archons, those inner rulers who express themselves through human awareness. One of the very first steps to be taken in inner work is the differentiation of one's conscious ego from these archetypal complexes. This is why such work can be so dangerous. It doesn't take much imagination to realize that we're dealing with the same forces which overwhelm and fragment the personalities of psychotics. The ego complex, that component of the psyche which consists of the conscious awareness of a space-time dimension, is but one of an indeterminate number of other complexes within the greater unconscious psyche. Despite its allusions to the contrary, the ego is not the subject of consciousness, but only one of many objects. From Jung again. But inasmuch as the ego is only the centrum of my field of consciousness, it is not identical with the totality of the psyche, being merely a complex among other complexes. Hence, I discriminate between the ego and the self, since the ego is only the subject of my consciousness, while the self is the subject of my totality. Jung, Psychological Types. A helpful metaphor for understanding this idea is seen in the structure of the solar system, in which the sun is the central reality, or self, and the satellite planets are its projected complexes. We no longer accept the naive geocentric idea that the sun and planets revolve around the earth, yet the equally erroneous egocentric model of consciousness still predominates. Doubtless, a naive observer on Mars or Jupiter would see his planet as the axis of the solar system as well, and it may be legitimately hypothesized that each autonomous complex dwelling in the unconscious psyche, pleroma, has a point of view not fundamentally different from this basic illusion. Since they empirically behave like others, there is no reason to assume that the archetypal complexes, archons, are not as separate in their dimension of the psyche as we are in ours. Such a fantastic idea contradicts all common sense, contradicts the persistent illusion that each of us is a unified being. What sort of hypothesis could reconcile these observations with our everyday experience? We are logically obliged to start from where and what we are, subjective observers. Therefore, we must begin with consciousness itself. We know that our brain and senses are activated by the autonomous energy of awareness. A human corpse has a brain and organs of sense, but no consciousness. The materialist states that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the organs through which it is manifested. But there is evidence to suggest that this is just backwards. What if consciousness were an a priori fact, and the organs of consciousness, the body and its network of senses, were merely a space-time vehicle for the manifestation of essentially multidimensional sources of energy? Here's a quote. Are thoughts and ideas created out of something? Thoughts surely exist, and perhaps all thoughts need a brain, but the brain is the mode of realization of the thoughts, not their cause. Brains alone do not create thoughts, any more than computers create calculations. Thoughts can be created by other thoughts, but that still leaves the origin of them unexplained. Sensations lead to some thoughts. Memory also produces thoughts. Most artists, however, would regard their work as the result of spontaneous inspiration. If this is so, creating a painting, or at least the idea of a painting, is a form of creation out of nothing. Paul Davies, Superforce.